Good evening, and welcome to Norwescon's presentation of the Philip K. Dick Awards. My name is Tanya Clark, and I'm your chair for Norwescon 43. We're excited today to bring you this special presentation sponsored by the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society in association with the Philip K. Dick Trust. Please enjoy the 6 readings by our phenomenal nominees, and I hope you have a wonderful time here at Norwescon's very first virtual convention.
Once again, as we had to do last year, we can't meet in person, unfortunately. So we're doing the award ceremony in virtual fashion. I believe this will be the first time that all my cats have actually been able to attend the Philip K. Dick Award. If any of them show up here, it's just to congratulate the winners. And whoever that winner is, as will be announced later, we should commend all of the nominees this year. This was an extraordinary year in so many ways. And the 5 judges came up with a great ballot this year. And I think we should get started with the readings.
Excerpt from The Doors of Eden by Adrian Tchaikovsky. After an hour of walking, they saw Robert's big grey-blue car, muddy and battered and in the middle of a field. No sign of the man himself nor any potential birdmen. However, they had also apparently stumbled upon a site of special historic interest. 3 standing stones stood in what Moll's guidebook charitably called a circle, yet was only ever going to be a triangle. "The 6 brothers," Mal declared, looking at the 3 monoliths derisively. "That's what the locals call them." She turned to Lee. "Is it colder?" It was colder. They stood there in shorts and T-shirts and shivered, dickering over whether to get more clothes out of their rucksacks. Lee looked up at the early afternoon sun, seeing it bright and fierce in a clear blue sky. The cold seemed something other, as though it was leaching in from elsewhere, or so Lee remembered later with the benefit of hindsight. Mal approached the nearest stone, which wasn't much taller than she was, flat and irregular, nothing like the decent workmanship of Stonehenge. On the inner faces of all 3 were lichen-clogged scratches that might have been local graffiti or Stone Age ritual magic. The Range Rover's door was open. However, there was no body slumped half out of the driver's seat. There was no sign of Cador Roberts at all. She even got down on her knees to look underneath, finding only that the ground was somehow freezing cold and soaking wet. "Lee," Mal said. She was standing by the stone, not quite touching it, and she was very still. "You can see forever." Later, Lee would try and reinterpret that pronouncement into something profound and prophetic, but probably Mal just meant the view. The stones marked out a rise in the moorland, and they could see for miles. What they could not see, however, was any sign of Roberts. The thought was almost as frightening as the sheep slaughter. Why would someone dump their car here and walk off into the tawny forever of the moors? "I think we're out of our depth here," Lee decided, and then a rolling line of shadow raced over, clouds obscuring the sun. That sky had been entirely clear a moment before, but weather could turn suddenly on the moors, Lee told herself. Then it began to snow. There was the moment when the summer sky above Lee was still mostly blue, and yet snowflakes were spiralling down, and she was such a city girl that alarm bells were still failing to ring. Then Mal shouted. Lee turned toward her and got a face full of blizzard. Abruptly, the wind was tearing around her out of nowhere. It brought great skirls of snow like the waves of the sea, raking her skin and flurrying at her clothes with 1,000 sharp fingers. She staggered forwards, leaning into the wind to make progress. Mal was in the midst of the storm, hunched between 2 of the stones. She had her phone out, trying to take a picture of the weather. Why not? It was prime Fortean phenomenon, unseasonal snow from an almost clear sky. Lee collapsed at Mal's feet and tried to wrangle raincoats out of their packs, flimsy cagoules, because they'd packed for rain, not for Scott of the Antarctic. The temperature had gone through the floor. Lee's fingers were already numb. She managed to hook the hood of one coat over Mal's head and fell back over into the nearest stone, trying to get her own on. The stones. That was what no amount of keep calm and carry on could handle. Before, there had been 3 wide-spaced stones in a field. Now there were suddenly 6. 6 brothers, like the locals said. The stones were having a family reunion. The one Lee was leaning against, a new one, had something painted on the inner face. The snow was doing a good job of washing off the redness it had been daubed with, but the artist had been following lines ground deep. She saw a curved sign. Then she reinterpreted it as a figure, leaping high with tail and beak pointed downwards and one leg extended, all depicted in a few elegant lines. "Lee," said Mal. "Mal, have you seen this?" "Lee!" Mal's voice was simultaneously tight and quiet, and very insistent. Lee looked up, and there were the birdmen. They were in the centre of the stones. No, they were where Lee's internal compass told her the centre of the stones ought to be, but things were wrong. It felt somehow like a paper cut to the eye when she looked in their direction. There were at least 3 of them, though the whirling snow, their snow, made it hard to be sure. They were a little smaller than people and quite a bit lower because of how they were built. She saw long legs, and a body canted forwards, counterbalanced by that long sweep of tail. It wasn't like a bird's spray of plumage now she saw it close up, but an actual tail, stiff bones and all. Their heads were round, surprisingly large behind their beaks. Lee stared into almost perfectly black eyes, huge, set forwards like a predator's. They were impossible, like Monk's marginalia or a bestiarist's fantasy come to life. They were closest to giant ravens, jackdaws, because their plumage was a scatter of black and white spots and bands. But her mind refused to take in more detail because they weren't animals at all. They had capes, animal hides secured at the throat and under the belly, shapeless as ponchos. One had a pack, bundled in skins and lashed down. Another had something, a rod, maybe a spear, balanced in the crook of its bird arm. It wasn't a wing, but had a sodden sleeve of feathers to it anyway. The hand with a crook of claws, like a taxidermist's joke. The central one, the largest, stepped towards Mal. Lee remembered the video that had shown sudden, frantic flight, but the same alien language of muscle and movement was here on display. She had forgotten the snow, the cold, had mind space only for the play of those lean muscles. The scales where the feathers tapered above the knee, the 3-toed foot with its inner digit held daintily off the ground like the pinky finger of a maiden aunt taking tea. Save that aunts didn't have hooked claws like that, not in her era, not in her world. It was 5 feet from Mal, who was trying to back away very, very slowly. Both of them reckoned they knew what had happened, first to Robert's sheep, and then most likely to Robert's. And that was where reality shouldered aside all the wonder and the dreams of 40 and fame, because they realised it was going to happen to them too. Thank you.
Since they were now fighting for their own survival, it was no great surprise when the launches began to shoot directly at Revenger. From the pattern of the shots, it was clear that they were trying to disable her batteries as a first measure, with the slow impacts ringing down the length of the hull like a rapid tapping of cat's claws. Few were tensed and reached for her helmet. These slugs had relatively low energy, for the guns on the launches were necessarily compact, but a lucky shot could still breach the hull or puncture a window. Besides that, she was sure that the remaining launches would consider calling in reinforcing fire from the main ships if they felt confident of keeping out of its way. She would not let them, if it was at all within her power. "Keep them moving, Paladin. Don't allow them to use us as a shield." "I shall do my utmost. I must caution you that we have lost 1 gun on the starboard battery and steering control of 2 on the port set. On the credit side, the second launch has a pressure leak and seems to be having trouble stabilizing itself." Her fist creaked as she opened and closed it, remembering the rat's spine as it had crunched between her fingers earlier. "Hit it as hard as you can. Hit it until they squeal. Spiky, spiky. They wouldn't show us a crumb of mercy, so we give them nothing back." The guns kept firing. But now there was a broken, lopsided rhythm to their drumbeat, and Fura knew in her heart that it was only a matter of time before she lost them all. "Sirt, how we're doing?" "Mr. Ruther says there's steam beginning to come out of the pipes, Captain, but I have to take his word for it." "I'm sure he's right, and I'm sure there's nothing more you can do for those batteries. I want you to go to the launch now and start preparing it for departure. Ruther will go with you, and he'll read out any dials and settings you ask him to. We ain't abandoning you. I'm not asking you to, but I want that launch ready to go at the drop of a pin. Tindoof, eyes your Captain. Go to our friends in the kindness room and bring them forward, including their crossbows. Make sure that they've that medical box I asked them to prepare. And what's of Mr. Paladin, Cap? If we takes ourselves is off the ship, won't we be leaving Captain Mr. Paladin behind?" "I shall see that he is taken care of, Tindoof." Somehow, she told herself. One by one, the guns were dropping out. She thought of the gaps in their rhythm as holes opening up in a battlement, each a point of weakness that the enemy were bound to recognise and exploit. The interval between discharges was lengthening, even as Paladin tried to coax a little more life out of each gun, even as the cooling circuit became progressively less effective. The solenoids were growing hot, the guidance rails starting to buckle, so that even the shots that did get away were not as powerful nor so well aimed. What had been a near continuous roar only a couple of minutes earlier was now more silence than noise, with their own guns only sounding every few seconds, and the enemy ships now concentrating their own fire on the few guns still operational. Once, a very heavy slug bounced off one of the launches and came tumbling right back to Revenger, hitting the galley side window side on and putting a milky flaw in that glass, like a span-wide cataract. Yet it held, for Bozer had outfitted her windows with uncommonly thick and strong material. "Launches are flanking us and preparing to make forced approaches at the lateral locks," Paladin said. "In 30 seconds they will be too close to shoot, even if none of their remaining guns give out. Then spare nothing, Paladin. Cook the guns and damn us with our own recoil if the rails crimp. But put everything into the next 30 seconds. Mash their noggins." It is now rather less than 30 seconds. The noggin part aside, I have already begun complying. She heard it and felt it, that last desperate volley. The shots harder, and the intervals between them briefer. She saw it all in her mind's eye. One glorious cannonade, the guns flogged like mad-eyed, whinnying cavalry horses, until they bled, or stumbled, or simply died, and then it was done. At the last moment, one of them did indeed seize, its guidance rails buckling, just as a slug was being launched, and the jolt from that was enough to wrench the entire coil gun from its mountings, arcing electrical gear, tearing cooling lines loose, and plunging the starboard gun room into vacuum. By then, though, Sirt, Tindoof, and Ruther had sealed the pressure doors to both gun rooms, and the evacuation was contained. Is that it? I'm afraid that it is. I have lost sight of any of the launches, but according to the sweeper, the more damaged of the two is now drifting away from us. I think we have done it some quite serious harm. Good, Paladin. Where does that put the other one? About 200 spans from the lateral starboard lock and closing. They mean to come in that way then. That would not be an unreasonable assumption. Fura pressed the intercom. Tindoof, can you hear me? I can hear you very well, Captain. We's just on our way back forward with the medical supplies as you mentioned. Dr. Adralda and Merrick's weren't too happy with me telling them what to do, but when that gun room popped, I thinks it was all the encouragement they needed. We's losing the ship, aren't we? Not if I can help it. She straightened in her chair and ran a hand down the lower part of her spine, where it was starting to stiffen from tension. We may misplace it temporarily. Have you done anything about Prosa since we last spoke? No, Tindoof said, sounding puzzled. And I was very particular about it, not being the sort of problem you ought to be troubled with, being our captain and all, and a pal of Prosa, which I know you were. Thank you, Tinduff. Are you past the lock already? Just going past it now, Cap. I want you forward as quickly as possible, in case we lose more compartments. Paladin, that operation we did on the port lock to initiate our turn, you would be referring to the over-pressurization of the chamber? She nodded at his globe. Do we have enough lung stuff to do something similar to the starboard lock? Our reserve tanks are now greatly depleted. To increase the pressure in the starboard lock, we would need to drain them completely, as well as all the compartments after the gunnery rooms. There's no one in that part of the ship, is there? She swallowed, glancing at the intercom. I mean, no one that we know of. No one that depends on lung stuff. Not now, Paladin answered, with a faint concern. Then do it. Pump up the pressure in the starboard lock as high as it will stand. I'm on my way down. Down where, if I might inquire? To the lock, Paladin. I've a farewell to make. And an apology.
I'm Alison Stine, and this is Road Out of Winter, about a young woman who tries to leave Appalachia after 2 years without spring. But in this scene, she and her friends discover the highway has been blocked. 2 men stood at the gate. They wore hunting caps, vests, and boots. They carried guns, big and black, rifles. They held them casually, like daughters. They were used to holding them or didn't care how they did it. The men had seen us. They had been waiting for us. Likely they had heard us coming a mile away on the road. Ice crunching under our tires, the rumble on the snow. One of the men held up his gloved hand. Stop. Where are we? Grayson whispered. It's a compound, I said. Lots of structures, a fence. This is their land. What do they want? Why do they have their guns out? The man who had made us stop approached the truck. Dance rolled the window down. The man wore aviator sunglasses. Can we help you, gentlemen? He said. He leaned into the open window and saw me. I swear his eyes widened behind the shades. Lady. I looked away at the fence. There was a dead deer hung on it, twisting in the wind. Dan said, we're passing through on our way to find family. We saw your skaters. It was the truth, but it felt like a lie. They had made us come down this road. They had given us no choice with the blockade of cars. They had crashed them on purpose. I was sure of it. Beyond the gate, I could see skateboarders again, gliding in the white sky, jumping and spinning. It looked like freedom. But it seemed off. Everything seemed off. The fence was too long, the gate too elaborate. There were bits of broken bottles and jagged glass stuck at the top. What could I see past it? A sagging farmhouse, some kind of concrete band shell near where the skaters were dipping and disappearing from view. Who would have built that? And who would skate now in winter, in the midst of this winter? The man tilted his head and let me know he was checking out the inside of the truck. Our food wrappers, blankets, and maps. I knew he was checking me out. I felt his gaze. I was padded as a bear. I wore jeans lined with flannel, my coveralls, my coat. But I wished I had worn 2 coats, wrapped myself in a garbage bag. I wished I had cut my hair short. Wished the guards at the gate were women. Wished the world was women. The other man had disappeared. Then we heard him shouting from the back of the truck. Mick, he said, they have a house back here. Mick, the man in sunglasses, grinned, a mouth of yellow teeth and chewing tobacco. Cool, he said, knocking on the passenger side window. Grayson rolled it down. The second man was there. He stuck his head in and talked to Mick across the seats. It's a baby house, he said. Looks like it's got a kitchen and everything. Interesting, Mick said. It's not for sale, Dance said. I didn't ask you if it was for sale, but I will ask you what you have for trade. Trade? Grayson said. Dance was speaking in a calm, quiet voice. We just need to turn around. We'll be on our way and won't bother you. Turn around goes through our place. Listen, sir. Grayson held up his dead phone and shook it. Do you know what's going on? The weather? Any news at all? We can't get any service. Service? We never had service here. Maybe it's an uprising. The man looked into the distance. Maybe it's a Tuesday in West Virginia. We'll pass straight on through, Dance said. We won't even stop. You don't have to stop, the man said. If you drive this way, you pay us. It was a racket. They had dragged the cars over to block the highway and were hitting up everyone who took the turn, like we had, ignoring the warning spray painted on the sign, misreading it. I stared at the back of Grayson's head, his neck held stiff and alert. If we didn't produce an item they wanted, the men would start going through our truck. They might find the grow lights, the cash, the gun. I sensed the leather pouch of seeds against my neck, warm and soft against my skin. Grayson said, "What if we give you," but Mick said, "Oh, we don't want any of your things. We have plenty of things. We're stocked. We're good to go. We've been ready for something like this for a long time." "That's right," the second man said. "We want to know," Mick said, "what you can do." "Do?" Grayson's voice cracked. Mick and the other man turned their heads and stared into the back seat, at me. Everybody looked at me, Dance and Grayson craning back over their shoulders. Then they spoke at the same time, both to the men with guns, though Grayson looked at me when he said, "I can cook." "I'm a truck mechanic," Dance said. "What?" Mick said. Grayson started to repeat himself, but the man said, "No, your friend, what he said. I'm a truck mechanic." What an amazing liar, I thought, before I realized he was telling the truth. "That's your job?" "No," Dance said, "but it was my daddy's job, before he got too drunk to do it. And he taught me everything he knows." "Works for me," the second man said. In the back seat, I said nothing. The men pulled back from the windows and stepped away from the truck. With their guns, they indicated we should drive through the gate. "Pull up to the main house," Mick said. "You'll know it." Dance rolled up the windows and gave a friendly fake wave. Once we had driven a few feet away, and I could see the men in our rear view, standing in the frozen dirt, admiring my tiny house, Grayson said, "What the hell did you just get us into?" "I got us out of a whole lot," Dan said. "They weren't going to let us leave, not without," he glanced at me, something bad. "Can you even fix trucks? Do you even know what you're doing? Was any of that true?" "It's all true. My daddy was a mechanic once. I can fix whatever they want." "Well, they're going to want a lot." Grayson slapped the dashboard. "Why did we come this way?" Dance looked at me in the mirror. "Will, are you okay?" I had felt a jolt go through me when I had seen the men, when they had leaned into the cab and noticed me, the way their voices perked up at the sight of a woman, the way they had paid attention. I had a bullet lodged in my chest, ice in my throat. I felt like I was being strangled. How could I tell the men that? "I'm fine," I said. We traveled up the driveway through the gate. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Christopher Brown, Chris to my friends, author of Failed State. I'm delighted to be able to join you this evening from my Apocalypse Ready Airstream here where I work and our home in the edgelands of East Austin, Texas. And I'm sorry we can't gather together in person this year. I love Seattle and the amazing community of writers and readers up there have been really important to me in my work over the years. So hopefully next year. When I finished the final revisions on Failed State in February of last year, I had no idea that very shortly thereafter it would suddenly feel like we were all living in a very real world failed state, nor that that feeling would last so long, although I like to think it's beginning to subside somewhat. I wrote the book during a challenging personal year on a very tight schedule, circumstances about which I would have no business complaining to the namesake of this award. And of course, later in the years, I'm sure all of my fellow nominees can attest, I learned about some of the unique challenges that come with launching a book into a world of shuttered bookstores and virtual signings. So this nomination is a wonderful affirmation of the work for me as its author and deeply appreciated. All the more so since having been a judge of the award a few years ago, I have an idea of the quantity of diversity of amazing works of science fiction that the judges have to draw their shortlist from every year. Failed State is dystopian as advertised, but hopeful and even utopian in its aspirations. The story of people trying to build a greener and more just future from the ruins of the one they broke. It's realistic, it's dark at times. I hope it's also funny. And that much of the humor comes from its screwed up protagonist, a burnout lawyer named Donnie Chemo, whose heart is in the right place, but who manages to find himself often on the wrong side, usually because of something he's messed up. And in this excerpt I'm going to read from the beginning of the middle of the book, Donnie is arriving in a post-revolutionary breakaway community to appear before a very different kind of truth and reconciliation tribunal, one seeking reparations for the destruction of the American wilderness. Unfortunately, he's on the wrong side of that case, a bargain he's made to have a parallel case involving crimes, to save a parallel case involving crimes against humanity and to save his own butt. Before I read, I just want to express my appreciation to my editor, David Pomerico at HarperVoyager, and to the rest of the team there, and to the cover designer, Owen Corrigan of HarperCollins, for this amazing hot pink cover that somehow manages to encapture all the disparate threads I tried to weave together in this book in one powerful image and one bold kind of color statement. It's the kind of cover that makes you, as its author, only hope that what's inside the book can live up to its promise. So I'll have to leave others to judge that, but I'll give you a little snippet here from chapter 21. It had stopped raining that Friday morning when Donnie headed to court in the flooded ruins of New Orleans. The locals didn't call them ruins, they called them liberated territory. The law they applied in their new court, which they called the tributary, was a new kind of law no judge had ever seen, even though they said it was the oldest and truest law in the world. Most of the so-called locals were people from someplace else, veterans of the uprising or latecomers who wanted to help beta test a different kind of future. Donnie used to feel like an honorary local, even when the city was under siege, and he expected to soon be reunited with some of his old comrades. But as he waited for the streetcar in the muggy morning air, he knew they might not be happy to see him, especially when he was showing up on the other side of the case. And when he checked his phone for news on the case he had left behind, all he got was the warning that he had no signal, because one of the first things his old clients did when they took over the city was to climb up the towers and replace all the corporate phone cells with birdhouses. They had their own network, which they said was free and open, if you could figure out how to get in. So Donnie cursed them and then tried to convince himself that it was a good thing to be offline for a day and just focus on the immediate task at hand. He looked down the median that cut through St. Charles, first light on dewy grass that had been allowed to go long, and noticed how quiet the city had become. No engines, no cars, no trucks, no honking, no grinding, no screeching brakes, no air conditioners, no amplified music, no overflying jets or choppers, just birdsong, the sound of a tropical city gone back to green. It looked and sounded pretty, but it mainly made him sweat, a sweat that started under his arms and in the small of his back, the kind of Mugtown sweat you can tell by breakfast is going to make you want to shower and change of clothes by noon. He would have to make it until evening when his transport was scheduled to take him back to his true habitat. The thought of what awaited him back home if he failed made him look at his watch anxiously, wondering if they even had a timetable here in the city that capitalism forgot. He reflexively straightened his tie, even though he should have been taking it off. And then, after what seemed like an hour standing there, but wasn't even half that, he heard the bell of the approaching streetcar before he even saw it. Maybe because the front light was off, something that was no surprise given that the streetcar was the only means of independently powered transportation still running in New Orleans, off the power of the sun. When she opened the door, the driver, a 20-something lady who wore a green jumpsuit and a revolver, gave him the look you would give a marooned time traveler you found by the side of the road. "I hear this is the way to the future," said Donnie. She laughed, and then she held out her hand. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Elwin Cotman. Thank you for nominating me for the Philip K. Dick Award, and I'm going to read just a portion of the title story from my collection. This is Dance on Saturday. Upgrown from the tilled soil, the vines grew thin as old memories. They thickened as they twined 6 feet up the trellis to bloom in a panoply of grapes, raspberries, passion fruit, kiwi, and blackberries that shone on the chapel walls like many-hued jewels. Fruit in the church would look odd anywhere, let alone the Garfield neighborhood of Pittsburgh. But in every other way, this was a normal ministry. A podium, a choir section closed off due to lack of parishioners, an organist and a drummer to the right side, and 2 squares of gold filigreed bars on both walls framing the altar. They may have been air vents or decoration, no one had ever really known. The Fruit of Jehovah Baptist Church was a red brick building that had swelled with amen since the northern migration, and, for the first time in recent memory, black-clad mourners filled the pews to capacity. Riley Brown was dead. Standing 4 rows from the mahogany casket, T.T. reached out to pluck a kiwi. She bit through the skin, and her gums turned to a battlefield between sweet and sour. On the dais, the All Nations Presbyterian Divine Choir clapped and sang I'll Fly Away, 4 unified voices rolling over the mourners and out the double doors to flood the summer sky. Verse after verse had T.T. dancing on her toes, wishing the song would never end, in contrast to Warmel at her left hand, the picture of stoicism. He fanned himself with the pamphlet that said homegoing for Riley Brown in gilded calligraphy underneath a slipshod Xerox of the departed that made his face resemble a jigsaw piece. Positioned among the mourners were the Fruit, a term known and used only among themselves. There were 14 of them, counting T.T. and Warmel. While the men wore black suits, the women adorned their colossal church hats with feathers and sequins and leaves, the rocking of their heads like a galaxy of swift-moving planetoids. She spotted 2/3 of the trio known as the Hallelujah Crew. Sister D, short and round and beautiful. Sister E, taller yet equally rotund, her face wide and lavishly wrinkled. There was Murray, a tall and strapping man who'd taken to wearing women's clothing. For the funeral, he debuted a smoke-gray dress, black sequined shawl, and a crown that looked like a disco ball. On the dais sat 5 deacons in high-backed chairs, somberly nodding. They had ponderous titles. One was a divine servant of strawberries, another the Lord Gardener of Granny Smiths, and they were known for their weighty personalities. In appearance, they ranged from a young woman to a 60-year-old man with hair in his ears. All had dark and endless eyes. The pastor of the podium was a rotund and youthful man with silver at his temples and square spectacles. Organ blasts sounded every time he paused for breath. He said, "Let us give thanks to the Lord for the fruit that sustains us, gives life, and holds memory." This he reminded them of every sermon. As their memories changed to fit new circumstances, they trusted the earth to stay constant. His new blue eyes had T.T. guessing. Blueberries? Grapes? "There is no greater loss than that of a loved one," he continued in his baritone voice. "But we must remember, this life is but a doorway to the eternal life Jesus promised us. If there was one thing to say about Brother Riley, it was that he loved Jesus. And he knew one day he would finally meet his Lord. I would ask you to rejoice, for that day is come." T.T. began to cry. Were she a vulgar woman, she'd have cussed out Riley in his casket. This funeral felt as wrong as the selfishness of him for letting his pancreas ossify. He was dead. Damned dead. Present and absent, flesh and air. His choice offended her. How could anyone alive not be offended? Let alone someone like her, who lived forever. It seemed as if the waxy face in the box was mocking her. Out of them all, Riley had chosen to experience the 20th century. It happened under their noses in the time it took to scratch your nose. His aging from a child who smelled of bananas to a man who smelled of knee socks and tax reports, then to a faded elder who walked with elbows bent like a grasshopper. He filled his decades with superhighways and rock and roll, with cancerous air, with black rights given then taken away. Maybe he chose suicide to cure the loneliness, she thought. Though she knew loneliness, which, unlike most ailments, had no cure, she resented him all the same. He could have talked to us about it, she thought, because he wasn't alone, not with 14 brethren. Still, even they might have been unable to sway a choice he'd had centuries to dwell upon. Despite her anger and disappointment, she knew this could not be the first time one of the Fruit had unlocked that moss-furred door between here and the afterworld. She just couldn't recall. Being of the Fruit offered her incalculable biological advantages, but but her brain functioned more or less like any other, best capable of storing the most recent information while older knowledge melted to sludge in the basement of her subconscious. After the reading of Paul's letter to the Romans, Riley's 12-year-old goddaughter sang Amazing Grace. Next came a member of the jazz band he played with in Homewood, a lanky man who shared TT's high yellow color and gray eyes. He fluted a somber melody that rustled her bones. Family and friends gave tearful eulogies. As the remembrances rolled on, Riley adopted pit bulls, loved tailored suits. That time in high school, he fell out of a tree trying to peep in a girl's bedroom. She found herself touched. Save the peeping part, which Brother Byron should have known better than to bring up in church. Warmel squeezed her hand, and she smelled the leafy scent of kiwi off his big knuckles. The walrus-mustached man gazed on the pulpit and clucked his tongue. Strawberries, she remembered. His breath smelled like a parfait. To her shock and delight, a sound of screeching metal filled the nave, and Lord Decay appeared from the eaves, his slag metal cloak dragging the oaken floor. She grew dizzy from the voluptuous reek of motor oil she would always associate with the great lord. A glamour on his true form, most of the mourners barely noticed him, other than the suspicion they would reserve for a white man with a three-piece suit and 3 chins come to a black funeral. The fruit, on the other hand, saw a man with the head of a deer. Soft and reddish fur coated his diamond-shaped face, and he stared from the pulpit with eyes like ink. Thank you again. Take care.
Everything that lives hates us, it sometimes seems. Or at least they come after us like they hate us. Things we want to eat fight back hard as they can and oftentimes win. Things that want to eat us is thousands strong. So many of them that we only got names for the ones that live closest to us. And the trees got their own ways to hurt us, blunt or subtle according to their several natures. There's shunned men, too, that live in the deep forest and catch and kill us when they can. Nobody knowed back then who they was, whether they was just the faceless that had been thrown out of other villages, or if they had got a village of their own that was hid somewhere. But they was monstrous cruel, and worse than any beast. Against these things, we of Mythenrood, like every settlement of humankind, put up walls, hollowed out stake blinds, set sentries, tried every way we could to pitch our own hate against the world's hate, giving back as good or as bad as we got. We digged ourselves in and weathered it, for what else was there to do? Each season brung its own terrors down on us. In winter, the cold could freeze your fingers off if you weren't wary, and snow fell on top of snow until you couldn't make your way without web spreads or walkers. The snow was mostly just water set hard, but sometimes it had silver in it, and that was dangerous. If you drunk snow melt and you didn't sieve out the silver first, it could make you sick in your stomach. Old ones and babies could even die of it. In spring, the snow thawed, which was a mercy, but sometimes, maybe one time in 4 or 5, it would be a choker spring, and you would get something else coming alongside the thaw. Of all our mortal threats, I was most mightily afraid of the choker seeds because they attacked so fast and was so hard to fight. If a seed fell on your skin, you had only got just a few seconds to dig it out again before the roots went in too deep. After that, there wasn't nothing anyone could do for you, save to kill you right away before the seedling hollowed you out. In Mythenrood, our answer to that was to try to stop the seeds from falling in the first place. As soon as the warmer weather came, Rampart Fire, which in my day was Catherine Van Asten, would send out runners to check the choker trees for blossom. If she found any, she would strap on the fire thrower and walk the forest. Rampart Remember would plot her route, and 10 strong spearmen would journey at her side while she burned out the blossoms before the trees could seed. The spearman was to kill or fend off any beasts that might come, watching Catherine's back and her 2 sides while she played the fire thrower across the branches and seared the seeds inside their pods. Against the choker trees themselves, there wasn't any protecting that would avail, so Catherine and her spearmen only went out on days when the clouds was thick and heavy, and if the sun guns to show through, they run as fast as they could for the clear ground. Summer was hardest, because most things was woke and walking then. Knife strikes flying straight down out of the sun so you couldn't see them coming, mole snakes out of the ground, rats and wild dogs and needles out of the forest. Anything that was big and come by its own lonely self was give to Fur Van Esten to deal with. Fur was Rampart Arrow. She would take the creature down with one of her smart bolts. And if it was a drone that come, dropping out of the sky and throwing out its scary warning, one of Fur's bolts would oftentimes do for that too. But she had only just got the 3 of them, which meant someone always had to go out to bring the bolt back afterwards. We couldn't afford to lose none. If wild dogs or rats or knife strike swarms come, we had a different way, which was Rampart Knife. Loop Van Esten had that name when I was younger. Then Mardew passed the test, and it was given to him when Loop died. When a swarm attacked, Rampart Knife would stand up on the fence or the lookout and carve the beasts into pieces as they come. Then we would cook and eat the meat, as long as there was no worms or melters in it. Wormed meat or melted meat we kept well clear of, for even if you digged out what you could see, there was always more that you couldn't. I got to say, our fights against the rats was far between. Mostly it was hunters that seen them, a pack of ours crossing paths with a bunch of theirs in the deep woods and both going on their way, but watching each other out of sight, with spears all up on our side and teeth and claws out on theirs. Lots of people wondered how the rats could come through the forest even in the warmest weather, for it was plain they didn't fear the sun. Then one day Perlew Van Esten, Rampart Remember, talked to the database about it. The database said the rats had got something inside them that sweated out onto their skin when the sun come out and kind of stopped the choker trees from closing tight on them or choker seeds from breaking open on them and growing down into their bodies. I guess I don't need to tell you how wonderful a thing that would have been for us, to be able to walk through the forest without fear. Trees was our biggest problem always, and the reason why we lived the way we did, the reason why there was a clear space inside the fence 50 strides wide that we burned with fire and sowed with salt, the reason why we never went out to hunt except on days when there was rain or thick overcast, and why the dog days of summer meant dried meat if you was lucky, root mash and hardtack if you wasn't. The reason why we seen the world as being made up out of 3 parts, which was the village, the little strip between the fence and the stake blind that we called the half outside, and everything else beyond.
Thank you to all the nominees for sending your readings. Sorry we couldn't do this live. Next year, we'll be back in SeaTac. Before we get to the actual announcement of this year's awards, let me say a couple of words first about, most people, I think most of you know that the Phil Dick Award was created to honor Philip K. Dick, because so much of his best work came out in paperback original format, which was really the unloved child of publishing back in the day. And after he died, Tom Dish and Paul Williams and David Hartwell and Charles Brown felt the best thing to do for his memory was to launch an award in his honor that would celebrate paperback science fiction, which is what we've been doing for almost 40 years now. The award is chosen by a team of 5 judges, and this year's judges, as I think I mentioned at the start, did a great job under extraordinary circumstances, since they were impaled right about the time that lockdown started, and we didn't even know if we'd be able to get books from the publishers for a while. But as you can see, we certainly did, and they were certainly not hindered or affected in quality by the pandemic. So this year's judges deserve a huge round of applause. Were F. Brett Cox, Brendan A. Dubois, Cynthia Felice, Tim Pratt, and Jessica Reisman. And the award, as we always mention, is hosted by Norwescon, and it's actually sponsored by the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society. So it's a rare case of 2 conventions working together, a bi-coastal effort. And of course, it's supported by the Philip K. Dick Trust. And now I get to have my fun and drag things out for an hour while the poor nominees sweat it out, waiting to hear whether they've won or not. So what should I go on about this? Nah, let me get right to it. This year we have a special citation, which goes to, I can't even do the stunt of opening the envelope this year. Special citation goes to The Book of KOLI by M.R. Carey. And if we were doing this in person, I'd be making Mike get up to give a speech. You'll just have to imagine it, because it would have been a really good one. And now, if we've dragged it out long enough, have we dragged it out long enough? I could get my cats on screen. This year's Philip K. Dick Award goes to Road Out of Winter by Alison Stine. And once again, we have to make do with a virtual experience rather than the in-person experience. So that wraps it up. Ordinarily, we'd be telling publishers to send books for this year. We've just impaneled this year's group of 5 judges, and we'd be encouraging everyone at the convention to enjoy the music and the fine food, the fine desserts. But next year we'll be back, I expect. And in the meantime, thank you all for supporting the award, and congratulations to the winners. Thank you.